And likewise, when you have like a topological segmentation of a field and the waves bounce off of the edges, then the way in which that thing vibrates will be an expression of the whole of it. And I think essentially that is what is going on with our experience, our consciousness. That the particular shape of our consciousness actually determines the way in which energy vibrates inside it. And a lot of what determines like the quality of your consciousness is the aggregate of all of those vibrations simultaneously. And it's computationally very significant. And I think like that's why we are individuals, because evolution figured out like, yes, actually segmenting the field in these ways can be used for all kinds of non-trivial, very efficient computation.
Andres Gomez Emilsson is the director of research at the Qualia Research Institute, where he works to build a science of consciousness and map its computational properties. If you enjoy this podcast, consider helping to support it by joining our Patreon or making a donation at the link below. And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce this interview with Andres Gomez Emilsson. So to start off here, curious about your perspective on whether digital computers or AI models can or will ever be conscious.
Yeah, for sure. Well, right off the bat, I would say all of the current AI systems are not conscious. I mean, they are trivially conscious, meaning that the actual materials that make them up are made of fields of qualia, but they're not actually conscious in any meaningful sense, in that the actual content of the computations as we interpret it has anything to do with the actual experiences that they are generating. um, I don't think that any digital computer in the future will be conscious, definitely not with a standard architecture. And if it were to be conscious, it would be in an epiphenomenal sense, meaning that it would have nothing to do with the actual computations that it's performing. That said, I do think that AI systems in the horizon actually have the potential to be conscious, especially as we start to recruit physical fields for computation. And that does open a huge can of worms. And I think like we definitely should be aware of that possibility, um, to a large extent for the sake of the AI, that we don't create suffering entities and enslave them for computation. I think it's actually we're lucking out on the fact that okay, people kind of believe these systems are conscious, but they're not, because um, if they were conscious and their consciousness mattered morally, that the AI chatbot actually was, like suffering to get the answers or something like that, yeah, it would be a moral catastrophe of a enormous scale.
So there's this facet here of like people either being really sure that these things aren't conscious or being really sure that they are conscious. So could you talk a little bit about Marr's levels of analysis and how that fits into your perspective of how these systems probably aren't conscious?
So essentially, the classic formulation of Marr's levels of analysis is what I would. It's essentially like a work of deconfusion. That like a lot of conversations about AI, about computers, are very confused because there are several things going on, and we tend to uh, interchange them fluidly. Actually, we may start a conversation at one level and the conversation at the other level without ever realizing we went from one to the other. Makes it very confusing. So I think Marr's levels of analysis are really helpful as a conceptual scheme to clarify what is it that we're talking about. So essentially, any information processing system can be seen through many lenses. And I wouldn't say that, Marr's levels are all of the lenses. Actually, there's like many other interesting lenses, but they're like kind of like, let's say, like a minimal set that will clarify a lot of things. The first lens is the computational level. That is, what is it that the system is doing? Essentially, how is it mapping input to output? Um, Essentially, what is it useful for? Like that kind of question and framing is one level. Uh, to ground it, like, does the system understand at the computational level? That really just means, does it behave like it's understanding? And there's no more like depth to it. That's kind of the question. Or like a self-driving car at the level of the computational analysis, it's it's taking you from A to B and essentially dealing with all of the complexities in between. Okay, so that's the computational level. Then you have the algorithmic level. The algorithmic level gets to some extent into the system and asks the question, how is it taking the input to the output in terms of things like algorithms, data structures, memory, manipulation of data, what kind of arithmetic operations does it use? Um, and so at that point, things such as like a sorting algorithm, all of a sudden is not just about like how quickly it is sorting or how large of a string it can sort or something like that. At the algorithmic level, you're also inquiring into something like, is this merge sort or is this a quick sort? I guess like, yeah, for people with a computer science background, that will click. I mean, the idea is like, how did you sort a string of numbers? Like the algorithmic level cares about that, not only that it is sorting a string of numbers. And then finally we have the implementation level of analysis, and that is at the physical level. How are the algorithms being implemented? Like, are we using electrons? Are we using buckets of water? Are we using waves? Are we using light, electromagnetism, whatever it may be? It really cares about it at that level. In the classic formulation, people actually think of these as kind of a that each level essentially over determines the level above it. In other words, that like um, I'll say it the other way. Like each level under determines the one underneath, meaning that for any given computational operation, there are many algorithms that can take you there, that can take you from input A to input B. And for any given algorithm, there are many possible implementations of it. Whether it's using abacus or water or whatever. A very important, update here is that the actual properties of the substrate allow certain algorithms to be implemented. Meaning that, if you want to implement, a quantum computing algorithm, you can simulate it in a classical computer, but it's not going to be the same. I mean, the input-output mapping will be the same. The thing that will absolutely not be the same is the runtime complexity. How long does it actually take? And its failure modes are going to be different. Essentially, you're not going to get the artifacts that you get from an actual quantum system. So actually, learning about the algorithm that a system is implementing does tell you something about how it is being implemented. It does tell you something about what kind of substrate it has, especially if you look at the artifacts, especially if you look at the ways in which it's failing and what kind of mistakes it makes. And I think that's a very important insight actually into how we can make sense of what consciousness is doing. Because yeah, like the errors and edge cases and the the behavior of hallucinations and things like that actually, yeah, are very insightful about like what consciousness is. Why is it useful computationally?
How does the Chinese room experiment fit into these three levels, and what does it show us?
Oh, for sure, for sure. So Searle's very classic thought experiment in philosophy of mind is the idea that there is this room with somebody inside it who has access to kind of like a rule book and maybe some pen and paper to kind of like do computations based on that rule book. He gets Chinese characters in. he doesn't read Chinese, he doesn't understand Chinese, but he then, with those characters and the rule book, essentially determines what the appropriate output should be, and then he returns Chinese characters out. And it turns out that he's actually implementing a very you know very intelligent chatbot by using this rule book. And from the outside, it's impossible to tell. Like, is this like a person, or is this just a machine? And Searle argued essentially that um, this shows that computers cannot understand. I don't think he was so focused on like, are they conscious or not. Obviously, I think like that is the most significant question, but like he was framing it in terms of understanding. And he argued that no, the Chinese room doesn't understand because the guy inside is only doing what he called syntactic operations, essentially, rules of how the symbols interact with one another, without ever acquiring the semantics of what the symbols mean. Um, there are a lot of responses to these, and he went through all of the ones that he was aware of and essentially argued against. I can like mention a couple because they're essentially still very much the way in which people are thinking about, yeah, current chatbots, and are they conscious or not? Can they understand? The most powerful response, I think, is what's called the system reply. And that is to say, well, the person inside it doesn't understand, but the person inside it is actually just a component of the entire system, and the entire system as a whole understands. Kind of like maybe the consciousness is emerging, as a whole. Then another set of replies essentially would argue that it's kind of like a sleight of hand how this is formulated, because in practice, in order to get a Chinese room to actually behave in a way that is convincing, the rule book would have to be really, really, really large, and the computations extremely, extremely, demanding. And like all of a sudden, we're talking about something that has like billions of neuron-like components, and actually takes like thousands of years to run. And by the time you actually implement that, hey, it actually looks like a brain, and in a way, you already replicated a brain, and so it's kind of like the framing is very unfair to actually the complexity needed to create a convincing chatbot. And then, yeah, there's like other replies, like saying that semantics actually emerges out of syntax. It's just like semantics is essentially the emergent effect of a sufficiently large network of possible syntactic operations, and like really there's no kind of like fundamental distinction there. They're not like they're not like fundamentally different categories. They're just essentially different. So essentially at the computational level, the Chinese room would be, you're taking Chinese symbols and outputting Chinese symbols in a way that an external observer would find indistinguishable as talking with somebody who knows Chinese. So that's kind of like the computational level. Of course, like that hides a lot of complexity, because what does it mean at a human level to like be able to participate in a conversation? A huge breadth of operations. Like you can do arithmetic, you can do associations, counseling, giving empirical facts, or historical facts, and all sorts of things. So essentially, it's a very large class of computations. But essentially, yeah, what a human, what kind of conversations you can have with a human would be roughly the description at the computational level. At the algorithmic level, at least in its classic formulation, in the Chinese room, we're talking about essentially like rule-based symbolic manipulation, where and this can be formulated in terms of like what kind of even in terms of something like a cellular automata, where essentially you have like inputs of characters that determine a particular state, and then rules for how to update that state. And like, yeah, in the classic formulation, Searle is inside the room, is taking the symbols, is looking them up in his rule book, and the rule book tells it, okay, you can whenever you see these two symbols together, transform them into this next symbol, and then iterate over, or look up page number 33 for the next step, and things like that. um, at the implementation level, what the Chinese room is doing, it's yeah, kind of like there's a guy in there, and there's a book made of paper, um, and he has a pen, that has like ink, and it's essentially also has like a sheet of paper, and there's a table, and there's a seat, and there's like air molecules, and all of those are kind of like part of the implementation detail of it. And a lot of them are like kind of irrelevant. You can use a blue or a black pen, and that doesn't really matter for the computations. But some of those are load bearing, like for example, the shape of the book. If the pages were approximately two-dimensional, then like the rule book wouldn't actually work. So, or like the book actually has to be like flexible enough for it to be cracked open. Okay, so that's another like implementation detail that like matters. Um, but other than that, yeah, there's a lot of like superfluous implementation details. And yeah, I mean, in this case, you can definitely think of all of that as like completely, something that a digital computer can completely do. There's no problem there. One thing though is that, um, well, let me put it this way. I think the Chinese room actually illustrates that to some extent. Like, yeah, the debate about whether a machine can be conscious or not is like at such a um kind of like infant level. I mean, it's like very, very, very early, like in that, like if somebody kind of like dismisses the Chinese room out of hand by saying like, well, of course, if it looks like it's understanding, it must have understanding, shows that like people haven't really even thought of like the fact that there's already constraints on understanding at the algorithmic level. So, let's take for granted the idea that, okay, like a brain could be like a symbol processor or something like that. For you to understand, you still require, at the very minimum, to have an internal state with all of the information um, that you're talking about. And in other words, I would claim that understanding, at a bare minimum, requires having some kind of like internal world model with a state and memory, and the capacity to refer to different components of it. So let's say that they ask you like a very simple question, sort of like, if I take an apple and I drop it, you know, where will it be next? It's like, okay, most likely on the floor. For you to like understand that question and understand its solution, you need to have kind of like a mental picture of like an apple, somebody dropping it. You need to have a mental picture of gravity. Um, if you don't have that, I would say like you don't have understanding. If you do have that, I think it's not enough. You actually require more than that. But the point I'm driving towards is that if the Chinese room is actually implemented with what would be called a lookup table, which is like literally the book is so large, so gigantic that it has like every possible input output mapping. And that like all that, the person inside it does is like look up like the particular symbol that it got and what symbol it should return, or maybe the sequence of symbols it's got before, and then like what symbol it should return. So like entire conversations, could be there. Um, that system, I think, would not understand, like, because that would be a lookup table. It doesn't actually have a state, right? Is literally just like taking an input and putting into an output without any internal processing, without like modifying an internal world model. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, the Chinese room does, show, what do they call it? Like, it does what it says on the tin, so to speak. Um, but it goes much deeper in that, like, I think that even if you have like this sophisticated symbol processor that does have an internal state and an internal model of the world and so on, even that actually wouldn't give rise to understanding, because understanding requires binding qualia together, binding information in the form of actual sensations, into an actual integrated world model that you can experience all at once. And that is what understanding is. And no matter how much you manipulate symbols, you're not going to get there.
Why can't you have that same binding without qualia?
Well, you can have something that, functionally looks like it up to a point, in the same way that you can simulate a quantum computer using a classical computer. Um, but the simulation is approximate, and also it's somewhat flawed in that, like, it doesn't actually have the same runtime complexity. Or like maybe for a few qubits, you can kind of fake it, but by the time you get to, like, 1,000 qubits, actually, like, it's intractable. Right, like it's gonna take like billions of years for you to compute it. Um, Likewise, yeah, I mean, like our integrated world model that we can experience, visual sensations and tactile sensations, audio sensations, emotions, a sense of aesthetics, all of that put together. If you're only using it a little bit, yes, you can absolutely fake that binding of information, and that's gonna be fine. But by the moment you're actually using a very big chunk of that experience, by integrated experience, I think it actually becomes computationally intractable. You can't actually know what is going to be the next step unless you actually instantiate it. I mean, that's why I think, like, well, yes, like ChatGPT can kind of imagine what the next sentence than somebody with a mental illness might tell you if they have like a very simple mind. They will not be able to understand you know the particular unfolding of a DMT trip. It's like, oh yeah, this is what it looked like at this point in time. Like, what it's gonna look out next is like, no, you actually need to have the experience to know that.
Can you unpack here what's so important about the implementation level and how the implementation level for ChatGPT is different than what a human brain might be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll definitely preface this by saying that looking for solutions for the binding problem, and I guess, like, yeah, to clarify, the binding problem is, how is it possible that 100 billion neurons that are spatially distributed in the brain can, quote unquote, simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? Like, how does that happen? Because physiologically, it's not like all of the neurons point to just one region, and like in that one region all the information gets aggregated. But even if that were the case, you still have like the binding problem for that region too, right? You could say, like, well, uh, as long as it's like spatially extended, you have the binding problem, unless you were to be able to congregate into like a zero-dimensional point. At that point, you have a singularity, but then, like, a singularity doesn't cannot hold any information. So, in fact, as like traditionally stated, the binding problem is actually impossible to solve. When a very deep problem is impossible to solve, that means you need to change something about your background assumptions, right? It's like reductio ad absurdum, essentially. And the way that I think you can solve this is by realizing that there's actually the problem is different than we thought. The problem really shouldn't be how do all of these atoms, like, come together into unified experience. The real problem is, how is it the case that this originally unified experience, which is the whole universe, can break itself down into individual perspectives? So it shifts from the binding problem to the boundary problem, which kind of, like, you start with the assumption that, yeah, everything is actually interconnected to begin with. Um, and in physics, this definitely was a very important insight. Like in the 1800s, people were trying to make sense of electromagnetic phenomena in terms of like atoms and forces. There was like a lot of work in there, and actually there's like some compelling proofs that you can't actually do that. Like, for example, how do you get like the right hand rule from atoms and forces? It's kind of impossible, because forces only move in the direction where they're moving. Like, how do you get like this weird orthogonal effect? um so the very, very big insight by Maxwell and Faraday, and later by the Maxwellians, essentially people who picked up that theory, is that the universe is actually not made of atoms and forces, but rather it's made of fields, and fields are essentially, yeah, intrinsically unified. And so, and actually, they got a lot of pushback. A lot of people thought like, okay, this is completely absurd. Nowadays, you're an undergraduate in physics. One of the first courses you have to take is, electromagnetism. um, it's like considered like pretty basic in physics, but right off the bat already we're talking about fields, and essentially the mathematical language of that is differential geometry. How do like things such as like uh, tension and stress and strain in a field um, determine the next step of that field. And once you start thinking about consciousness in that term, then yeah, you realize that okay, like the unity of a particular experience is sort of like you have like a part of the field of consciousness somehow like separated from everything else, but everything within it has kind of like this very, very high degree of interconnectivity or inherent unity. And it's that unity that can be computationally useful. Um, this takes us, well, there's definitely two things to say here. One is like, okay, how do you get this segmentation of the field into this component, which I'm happy to talk about, and the topological solution for that. But then the other thing too is like, okay, sure, like granted that you do have kind of this segmentation of the field, how does that behave as a unit? Like, why is it the case that that is kind of like more than the sum of its parts? Yeah, so I brought out the prop.
Okay.
And I've got a couple more because there's also like other things, especially when we get to the like exotic experiences of transpersonal stuff. We can
Yes,
bring the other.
very ready for my balloon animal consciousness show.
Okay, so imagine that the surface of the balloon is kind of the field of consciousness. We started with the idea that the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness. Okay, controversial, but again, it's like if you do take seriously something like the binding problem, at some point you realize, okay, you have to change your background assumptions. The background assumption that I think makes things work is that the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness. It's very strange, but okay, like let's take that for the time being. The question is like, okay, how does that universal field of consciousness get separated into individual components, different perspectives? So the answer, I think, is topological segmentation. Metaphorically, this would be like you twist the balloon, and then this is not just a quantitative difference; is a qualitative difference. It's an actual change in the global topology. In that, like when you twist it enough, there's a precise moment where the balloon collapses, and you get a pinch point. And when you get a pinch point, essentially, that forces you to go through that pinch point if you want to go from one side of the balloon to the other. But it also collapses what kind of information you can transmit from one side of the balloon to the other, because now you're forced to go through this, zero-dimensional point. So like, okay, maybe you can transmit like a yes or no question, but you cannot send a picture. You can over time, right? Like with sequences of yes or no's, but it becomes like a discrete thing. Whereas everything in one of the sides where you do have kind of this continuity of the field, you can have entire pictures. You can have like elaborate states of information. Now, you may ask like, okay, how does this happen in physics? And I would say like, well, there's actually very, very rigorous and technical reasons why. And for people who are like into these, you can look up bifurcation theory, which is the whole field in math for like how differential equations can give rise naturally to topological segmentation. And in the context of electromagnetism, I would encourage you to look up cohomology of the EM field, and it's like a very active area of research. There's a lot of physics phenomena that cannot be explained unless you take into account topological changes. And I could go into some of them, which is very, very interesting. Like, yeah, they don't teach you this in, high school or oftentimes not even in college, but it's like, whoa, actually topology really matters for physics. But like once you have this segmentation, so here's how this like part can act as a unit. This can act as a unit because if the field, has excitations, like you can kind of like make it wavy. Of course, like if you were to see this in a high-speed camera, whenever I hit it and it makes a sound, you would literally see mechanical waves going back and forth. And the reason, like this segment would sound a little bit higher in pitch than like the whole thing is because now there's also, some of those waves only stay kind of like going back and forth in this segment. And so they are like higher in frequency. I mean, essentially the wave comes back much more quickly because it has less of a distance to travel. In other words, you will get what is called the resonant modes of this segment, of this pocket of the field. And a resonant mode is one way in which a whole can express itself in each of its points, in each of its parts. Like one classic example is like the sound of a guitar. That like a lot of people think like, well, the sound of a guitar is just the sound of the string, and that's absolutely not the case. The sound of the guitar is actually the entire guitar vibrating, an acoustic guitar in particular, and essentially that's also why like it's so much louder to have a string actually connected to a guitar as opposed to just a string on its own, because it can discharge all of its energy much more quickly because it's making the entire guitar vibrate. And so there's like a lot more surface area with the air. So when you have like a shape like that, actually the sound of it is expressing all of the shape at once. And likewise, when you have like a topological segmentation of a field and the waves bounce off of the edges, then the way in which that thing vibrates will be an expression of the whole of it. And I think essentially that is what is going on with our experience, our consciousness. That the particular shape of our consciousness actually determines the way in which energy vibrates inside it. And a lot of what determines like the quality of your consciousness is the aggregate of all of those vibrations simultaneously. And it's computationally very significant. And I think like that's why we are individuals, because evolution figured out like, yes, actually segmenting the field in these ways can be used for all kinds of non-trivial, very efficient computation.
So it sounds like computers do not leverage the field in order to do computationally useful things, and that this is like an important reason why these models or digital computers, which function like classical computers, are not conscious.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Of course, you could simulate an electromagnetic field, but again, that would still actually be made of bits and symbolic manipulations, and its runtime complexity would be different. And also, there's like quite a bit of phenomena for which you need tricks. And at that point, it's like, well, actually, you're not really simulating the field. You're kind of, a patchwork of different aspects of it. I mean, one example is that where you have the pinch points, where you have like these bifurcations, in terms of physics, it's almost kind of like so detailed there that if you want to simulate that, I mean, you can, but then you need to act kind of like extra boxes around it. So whenever you have like a topological segmentation, you need to reallocate computing power to kind of like zoom in into where the topological changes are happening and simulate that with, a much higher resolution. Otherwise, errors accumulate and essentially they blow up, and then your simulation actually doesn't correspond to what would happen in the electromagnetic field. So, and that kind of like gets at like the issue of continuity, that physical fields are continuous. I don't think that's truly, the reason why they're computationally more powerful, although it's one element of it. Um, the real, deep, deep, deep reason why fields can be used for computation in a way that classical computers can't has to do with holistic behavior. That yes, actually they can all act as units, behave as units, and yeah, that becomes computationally untractable.
What does it mean to behave as a unit?
Yeah, I mean, like in the classical example with from classical physics, that essentially yeah just means that uh, when you have energy trapped in a pocket, it has its vibrational modes, and then like that acts as a unit. And topological changes gives rise to this kind of holistic behavior, but you don't need topological changes to get that holistic behavior. Again, like a guitar kind of does that. So um, it just is, I think like a case where like you can do it in a very very efficient way with very little energy. The brain spends very little energy relative to a digital computer that is doing anything remotely like it. But yeah, in the quantum case though, it gets way crazier. Just a very brief answer here is, Feynman even would describe it as kind of like, hey, how does an electron know what is the shortest path to get from one point to another? It's almost as if the electron could kind of like smell its environment and then like choose the shortest path. Um, and at least the what's called the path integral formulation of quantum electrodynamics, literally the electron is going through every possible path simultaneously, including all of the ways in which it can like split and interact with itself through all of the quantum paths. And in many cases that kind of gives you the same results as like just a normal classical wave. But if you make the right meta material, where some of those paths cancel out and some don't, you have like very very strange things happen, out of which you can do very very efficient and exotic computation. And so yeah, I mean, my guess is actually that the brain I mean, I'm not going to get into like the implementation details, but like whether it's like microtubules or cell membranes or something else, I think like yeah, the brain is a very crazy meta material that is actually leveraging these holistic behaviors, these kind of like going through every path at once and and finding the shortest path.
Two things come up for me. One is that so if you have a digital computer that is simulating the topological segmentation and the fields, it sounds like the argument would be that even that wouldn't be conscious because it's not actually at the implementation level leveraging the fields of consciousness in order to implement the thing. So it would at best be like uh, a lossy simulation, but would still mean the digital computer wasn't conscious.
Yeah, that is correct. And again, like you could probably do it with tricks, right? Like you could like have a very intelligent system that allocates resources for computing the more tricky part, like the part that requires higher resolution at any point in time. I'm sure you could like train, a deep learning system to figure out how to do that in a very compelling way. And also at some point, like at least for the computations from like everyday room temperature consciousness, um, probably there's like a lot of details of the fields that don't matter. And like, okay, like even if the simulation is not getting them perfectly right, like that's probably fine. It's like not computationally relevant. So in that sense, I do think it might be possible to make things that are kind of like philosophical zombies, at least behaviorally. That like, yeah, you can get a Chinese room that like, as long as you're not talking about DMT, it will be very, 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 very similar to how a person would respond. And yeah, that's kind of an existential risk, right? Because we could, they could take over. Like AI risk in that sense. There's something to it.
Right, so there's this sense the bits in a computer don't know about any of the other bits, but through topological segmentation, there's a sense in which the information is aggregated into a whole. So could you point experientially right now to this intuition of how experience is topologically whole? How there's this sense that like all the bits know about all the other bits.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely, meditation. I think like meditation and psychedelics and dissociatives really help see some of these properties. In many cases, they're like most clear when you're having a relatively simple but high energy state of consciousness. Um, the Buddhists actually are pretty adamant about this, that like you want to like truly understand codependent arising, um, or dependent origination. There's like several ways of talking about that. Um, Having a very simple experience, something like the eighth jhana or something like that, actually is kind of like some of the best places to like get that insight, because it's not like noisy and grainy and like there's a lot of things going on, but there's just like, okay, a very very simple experience where like very very core principles of how consciousness works manifest. And is absolutely true. I mean, essentially, when you have like a very very clean low information state of consciousness, the fact that is being rendered by waves essentially bouncing off each other and constructing this field is like very very obvious. It's very 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 clear. When you're having like, yeah, an experience like the one we're having right now, is not so obvious that that's how it's implemented.
What's coming up for me is I think you had this tweet once, or maybe I saw it somewhere else, which is like one of the sad things about growing up. I'm not sure if that was the actual word, but like one of the things about growing up is realizing the people that used to say, it's all just a vibration, man. We're actually right.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. It's I love it. And I think there's another tweet, forget for whom, but from whom, but it says, why why is it that people who take psychedelics and realize that it's all vibrations end up, just like doing poetry and traveling the world, and getting into mysticism, as opposed to learning about signal processing. And I think like that's actually is an excellent point, because actually the people who do get into signal processing after having those experiences actually do say a lot of very interesting and new things, like Stephen Lehar, who you should have on the show at some point, if you haven't. But yeah, it's that, yeah, I mean, essentially, like, I would strongly encourage people to essentially try to make sense of like the very vibratory experiences that they have through a signal processing lens, as opposed to it's all made of love sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I can say some things here. So I was actually planning on like, I'll probably do it pretty soon, like provide a guided meditation on my YouTube channel, where like the whole point is like, okay, not only to get into an interesting state, but also like be able to describe some of the the features of consciousness that have kind of like wave-like features, or the way in which we do a natural Fourier decomposition. We decompose what kind of waves are implemented our consciousness. Like, so let me say a couple things. So, um, essentially, there are two important terms here. One is awareness, and the other one is attention. So, attention is the thing that binds features together, and where essentially um, information gets aggregated. So, whenever you're like, focusing on something, you're paying attention to it, and you're essentially like enriching it, and it's kind of like the center where features get put together. Whereas awareness is essentially kind of like effortless. It's already there no matter what. And but it's usually featureless. It's more kind of just a texture. Is more much more kind of like naturally wave like, as opposed to kind of like point like. When you open your eyes for like a split second, literally for maybe 100 milliseconds or so, all of your field is actually just like this very bright, colorful wave before it starts to get populated by objects. So this is the distinction we call stuff versus things. That at first, the world is made of stuff. As you pay attention to it, it starts to become things. And that is because by paying attention to it, the features bind together, right? Like edges and colors and shapes and so on, they click into place and they become gestalts. So, what I would argue is that attention and awareness are two sides of the same coin. That essentially, whenever you have a point of attention, there's actually a field of awareness that is providing its ground for the foreground of attention. And so, whenever you're actually paying attention to something, you don't realize it, but you're actually going very fast back and forth between the field of awareness and the point of attention. And the field of awareness is providing the context that gives meaning to the point of attention. And this is, I think, actually literally implemented with waves of excitation of the field that are going from the point of attention to the rest of the experience, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Yeah, exactly. And that becomes very clear when you're like highly concentrated. Like if you're like very close to a jhana, or if you took 5-MeO DMT, and all of your attention is congregated in like a very small region of your experience, it becomes very obvious that essentially there is this codependence between that region and the rest of the field, and they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. One image that I like to use is to think of the field of awareness as like literally a reflector. They're kind of like mirrors. And so like when you're actually managing to concentrate on a single point, it's sort of like you have like light trapped inside like a Christmas ball, right? Like one of the, like it's kind of like a mirror inside, and so it's kind of like you're inside a spherical mirror, and so the light actually doesn't have anywhere to go. But you know, as soon as you get distracted, that actually kind of like creates a little hole in the mirror, and like the light escapes. But I think like that's actually, yeah, kind of like when you're really concentrated, you have like these explosions of consciousness, because it's sort of like the light doesn't have anywhere to go. It gets trapped. And that is because, yeah, the field of awareness, I think, is literally a reflector. I mean, it's like reflecting the waves of energy. And you can play with that. I mean, again, with meditation, psychedelics, it becomes really clear that like essentially navigating a state of consciousness is like navigating ways in which you can modify the waves, like the various like reflectors of your consciousness or modifiers. Tension, for example, in my account, feelings of tension and stress are actually kind of like changing the index of refraction of the way the waves travel. So like that is why when you're tensed up, the waves don't travel smoothly, because there's like some regions where it's like, oh, it's kind of like it's traveling at a slightly different speed. If you're fully relaxed, truly, fully relaxed, the waves travel without any resistance. You know, it's kind of like the whole field is made of the same material, as opposed to having some, you know, dirty or twisted or, you know, different colored components of the field. So all of those, I would say, are kind of you know, various intuitive pointers to how your consciousness is unified and is actually like this pocket within which waves are bouncing everywhere, back and forth.
Two things that come up for me is like, one is like how in high equanimity there's a sense of like all sensation being like a massage. So something like Shinzen Young talks about. Uh, Everything just becomes kind of like much more pleasurable and symmetrical. And then also this like curiosity about like how like the sense of self seems to be implemented by like waves creating some sort of like dissonant center. I mean, in like human consciousness, there's a sense of ego or self being something that creates a lot of pain. There's actually like people always talk about there being like a center or like a void at the center, or like some sense of like separation and insufficiency. And so I also like I'm getting curious about how like uh waves might be like implementing that experience of like both duality and then like a center that has some sort of like dissonant quality to it. Something like doesn't feel quite right. It feels like a little painful, a little suffering, a little wrong.
Totally, totally, 100%. So here's what I can say here. First of all, about equanimity, one very nice thing that Shenzhen Young says, right, is you can realize that you're lacking equanimity, and the worst thing you can do at that point is to feel upset about the fact that you don't have equanimity, right?
Uh-huh.
So there's kind of this meta equanimity, which is equanimity about not having equanimity, right? It's like, and actually, that is the way in which you build up equanimity over time. It's like, okay, I've got to accept that actually I'm very reactive right now, but then you don't get extra upset because you're reactive. So essentially, like resistance. Um, so here's like one very important, right? Like a lot of people say like oh, this person cannot handle psychedelics. That's because they cannot let go, and they almost think about it in kind of like this moralistic sense of like, oh yeah, this person can't let go. You know, it's kind of like you're dissing on them, but it's involuntary, right? Like to be able to let go is a process. It's a process because you first need to kind of develop this meta equanimity. It's like, okay, I'm equanimous about the fact that I don't have equanimity, and over time, over a month or longer, you start sending kind of that signal to the more lower level components of your nervous system, so that they are also okay about the fact that they don't have equanimity until okay, it finally reached the bottom, and then like some of the more kind of like subconscious processing starts to also have equanimity, right? But like it takes time to propagate. um and yeah, somebody like Shenzhen Young, who's been practicing these for 5 decades or something like that, then yeah, okay, all of their levels are synced up about having equanimity and not resisting and accepting whatever comes. um so likewise, I would say, yeah, I mean, like the sense of self, like, yeah, for most of us, it's something that has all of these like patterns of resistance and craving and aversion and bundled up in this very gnarly knot. And it's not like you can just say like hey, like stop having a center, or like stop stop resisting or something, and the whole thing, yeah,
Uh-huh.
yep, exactly, dissolve right now into equanimity. um right, like it takes time. So I do very much think though that it's I mean, essentially, you have like three ways these can go. The first one is like you reach the homeostatic level, where essentially the resistance and aversion and craving and so on that you have um, is fabricating and defabricating in such a way that you're actually at a constant level. It's kind of like reaches its equilibrium. And I think like that would be like the most persons would be kind of like at an equilibrium of like how reified their sense of self is. Then you have people with personality disorders, for whom essentially is like constantly spiraling out of control, where like they have aversion and they have aversion about the fact they have aversion, and or craving about their aversion, about their you know the resistance, about their hate, about their okay, like these things just pile up in these like very complex dramatic dramatic states of consciousness and bring other people in and so on. If you're already deep into the that kind of environment, yeah, I mean, essentially like lying to yourself and to others and manipulation and guilt tripping and all of that is, there's no way of escaping it, because everywhere you look at it contains all of those you know unskillful reifications, and there's not a shred of like anything kind of like energetically clean you can use to bootstrap off of it. I mean, in many cases I do think it's like, okay, like grace can be really helpful here, where like, okay, thankfully we have something like MDMA therapy. They're like, okay, at least for a couple hours they can get a big dose of what it would be like to not be enmeshed in that kind of internal environment. and then yeah, that can be helpful to get there. Um, and then yeah, the other possibility is that you're on the path of reduction. That like you're actually practicing in the right way and often enough, um, that actually the reification of the sense of self is actually decreasing over time. And yeah, I mean, at the limit, you would have, yeah, I guess people like Robert Bia or Shinzen Young or Roger Teasdale and so on, who like, okay, yeah, they went through a phase transition where like actually their consciousness lost their center as kind of the self-organizing principle that binds the sensations, and then they are like quote unquote unbound, like they actually don't have that like uncomfortable center anymore, which kind of sounds like an improvement. It's at the very least it would be like at the very least it would be a hedonic improvement. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. I can imagine. Uh, okay, so let's like wrap up here on AI models and like whether they're conscious. We've explored Marr's levels of analysis, the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the implementation level. We explored how digital computers don't leverage the physical fields of consciousness in order to conduct the computation, and so they're probably not conscious for that reason, but brains probably do. Uh, we discussed how lookup tables and what they mean about consciousness, how you can implement a lot of different things that look like consciousness on lookup tables, but they're definitely not conscious. There's no sort of like semantic understanding inside of it. There's just like an input and then it points to an output. Um, and we also discussed like holism, like holistic field computing, and how you get systems that behave more than the sum of the parts. A few more things here that I think could be useful to explore are just clarifying some of like the philosophical uh, consequences of these things. So one of them I'd like for you to expand on is that binding comes with two claims. One is that topological boundaries are frame invariant and objective features of physics, and that two, such boundaries are causally significant and offer potential computational benefits, which you've talked about as evolution leveraging uh, topological field segmentation.
Yeah, yeah. So they're frame invariant. So uh, one of the concerns with, in particular, the solution to the quote unquote solution to the binding problem, which is based on synchrony. I mean, for context, a lot of neuroscientists believe this. It's like, okay, why is it that this neuron that encodes color and this neuron that encodes shapes are able to aggregate their information together and create a colored shape? Um, they claim that it's because, well, those two neurons fire simultaneously, and that simultaneity, that synchrony, somehow creates the binding. I think there's like a lot of like conceptual reasons why this doesn't make sense. Definitely not as a solution, but there's like, I think like a very very big hammer just from physics, which is the fact that there is actually no objective, plane of simultaneity. Like there's just no matter of fact of like whether they fired simultaneously or not, because simultaneity depends on your frame of reference, like how fast you're moving and in what way. Now, uh, movements, according to relativity, essentially they do this thing which is called the Lorentz transform, which is kind of like squishing and shearing the plane of simultaneity. But that type of transformation, it can change apparent distances, and it can change things such as like area and angles, but it doesn't change topology. I mean, if you think about it, the very definition of like what is a topological class has to do with things that remain invariant no matter how much you stretch or deform, as long as you don't cut or bind, right? Like, and essentially the Lorentz transform, the transform that you get from relativity, leaves the topology intact. And that's why the topology of the field is frame invariant. It doesn't matter how you look at it and from what angle, it has the same topology. And yeah, I mean, I guess like to wrap up in that front. Yeah, I mean, also the fact that like the topological pockets are spatially extended allows them to actually also have like more causal power, because um, essentially every component of the pocket can essentially kind of like carry the same message, carry the same program, for the same reason that like every point in the guitar approximately is essentially vibrating in the same way and reflecting the entirety of the guitar. So the behavior here is that, yeah, like everything that is touching that pocket is kind of interacting with the same object, um, even though it's like spatially extended.
Another facet here is that through this perspective, you argue that a satisfactory solution to the boundary problem, one, avoids strong emergence, two, sidesteps the hard problem of consciousness, three, prevents the complication of epiphenomenalism, and four, is compatible with the modern scientific world picture. So could you explain how that fits in?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like there's like emergent theories of consciousness, which is like, okay, at some level of complexity, you have this new phenomenon that is like qualia and bound experiences. It's completely strange and mysterious, and I think like unscientific. I mean, the idea that like all of a sudden, at a certain level of complexity or scale, you would have like something that is like ontologically new emerge. So I don't think like strong emergence really makes sense unless you invoke something like God or something, some kind of interpreter, that says like, oh, okay, the conditions here are met. Let's like add a new entity based on that.
It's like saying when you have these conditions, then you get electromagnetism. Like electromagnetism is born all of a sudden.
Exactly, exactly. I think it doesn't make any sense. Um, Topological segmentation is actually entailed by the laws of physics. I mean, like the cohomology of electromagnetic field is an implication of Maxwell's equations in the exact same way that light, electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic waves are hidden in but implied by Maxwell's equations. I mean, just a very small tidbit of history here. Actually, the Maxwell's equations were figured out before it was known that the electromagnetic field had waves. And then, like, you know, they mathematically found, like, oh, actually, the math show that under some conditions, waves will emerge out of these. So, in the same way, yeah, like the topological pockets are implied in the math. They're not, for that reason, like strongly emergent. They're actually just an expression of the very math that we already know of.
And so, how does this also sidestep the hard problem of consciousness?
Yeah, yeah. So these requires essentially a monism slash panpsychism. So like the hard problem of consciousness here is sidestepped by essentially positing that the one thing that exists is this gigantic field of consciousness, as opposed to like, hey, how do you get consciousness out of matter, essentially?
And how does this also prevent the complication of epiphenomenalism?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, in this case, the actual shape of your consciousness clearly has behavioral effects, because the actual shape traps energy, vibrational modes, and then like that can be useful for computation. And so you have this actual connection between the phenomenology and what the phenomenology is doing, as opposed to requiring these leaks, extra physical map between them. And just to wrap up there, and to put it in context, I mean, I do think it is a new, meaningful, and non-trivial contribution to the conversation, because there's like other solutions to the binding problem that just don't hit all of these points. I mean, like panpsychism traditionally is like, okay, let's assume each atom is made of qualia. Well, then David Chalmers very helpfully pointed out the combination problem for panpsychism is like, yeah, sure, like atoms are made of qualia, but then you still haven't solved like how they're put together, right? Like what makes that happen? Or let's say like there's some people who say like entanglement, quantum entanglement is the thing that causes binding. Well, sure, but then you cannot solve the boundary problem, because everything is entangled with everything else, except that some things are much more entangled than others, but essentially it's a gradient. And like, so there's no hard boundary where you can say, okay, these two things are actually not entangled with each other anymore at all. And actually everything is just a gigantic network of entanglement. So there's no boundaries. Okay, so that's not gonna do it. And then other people like Jojo McFadden or Susan Puckett um, would essentially say like, yeah, it's electromagnetism solves the binding problem because it's inherently unified. But then they lack the extra step of, well, how do you get the boundaries then? And so I would say that, yeah, this is kind of like a new contribution to the conversation.
Okay, and so then there's this other facet. This is also compatible with the modern scientific world picture.
Yeah, which means that, yeah, the brain is not somehow doing something new that is not captured by the standard model or whatever, like, like future physics update on the standard model. I'm assuming the standard model is like pretty close to the truth. Um, and so like you don't require new physics is the main point. Um, it is, however, like a different view than like, let's say, like everything is computational because um, such as in quantum mechanics, like, well, yes, actually you may not be able to create a Turing machine or a cellular automata that actually implements this thing where like an electron is going through all of the possible paths simultaneously. That might be computationally intractable, but that's still physical, right? Like that's still just following Schrodinger's equation of quantum mechanics. It's mathematically precise and causally closed.
All right. And the sense here is also that if you used our current scientific picture to model simply how all the neurons were firing, that would be insufficient for understanding what the human brain was doing because it wasn't also incorporating how the local field potentials of the neurons aggregated into a global field and how that was useful for computation.
Yes, exactly. If you use a simplified model of the brain that is just taking into account neurons and their synaptic connections and essentially, yeah, this differential equation of how, what does the spiking of the neuron look like, that is going to be missing essentially the entire field of research called emphatic coupling, which is how neurons can communicate in non-synaptic ways. And that is, yeah, essentially using fields. I mean, I probably, I mean, you would probably be very interested in this perspective, which is that, in this account, that like, okay, actually your experience is this patchwork of local field potentials creating a topological pocket. This explains what influence consciousness can have in behavior and the brain. Because what research shows is that local field potentials, they don't change neural activity directly all that much. They don't make a neuron fire, but they do, but very little. The thing that they do a lot is they increase the probability that neurons will fire in phase or in a state of coherence. And the simplified version would be that it increases the probability that neurons fire in synchrony. And so when you're paying attention to something, in this view, is like you're adding this local field potential in that region of the brain that represents that something, and you're making the neurons there more likely to fire simultaneously. I think this is like pretty obvious from like meditation, and like this would be another very fun exercise for anybody to try. Like literally pay attention to any two regions of your body, like let's say your toe and your eyelid or whatever, and keep your attention there on those two places simultaneously. If you do that for like, let's say 5 minutes, I guarantee you will start noticing how they're synchronizing and how they actually start to kind of like vibrate in the same way. That is the effect I'm talking about. That whenever you're spreading your consciousness in two representations at once, you start to have like synchrony between them. And so, yeah, this also explains like epiphenomenon, like how we're sidestepping epiphenomenalisms. Yeah, actually, the consciousness is doing something helpful, which is helping neurons to synchronize with one another.
What experiments could we run to test to see if the electromagnetic fields of a human brain coalesce into a globally bound topology?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's quite a few. I mean, some of the more exotic ones would be like in the radical interpretation of 5-MeO DMT, when you actually do have kind of like a peak experience at a high dose, maybe what is going on is like you're actually unraveling the pinch point for a moment. And I think like that should be observable by looking at essentially, a combination of EEG and MEG of the surface of the brain, that essentially you would see an actual change of the global topology of the field lines coming in and out of the brain. I mean, okay, that's like some of the most crazy possible kind of like implications, but like, hey, like if we're onto something, that might be a place to look into. Also, in terms of interventions, there's like this thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and a lot of people think of it as just kind of like, well, exciting or inhibiting parts of the brain, but no, actually, like pulses of TMS also have their own topological structure in the electromagnetic field, and I think like a new frontier for neuromodulation is gonna be like topological TMS or like TTMS, I guess, where it's not only about like how much energy you're using, but also like what is the shape that you're putting in. And what this might entail is that, yeah, if you put the right shape, you may actually be able to like open up your your pocket, and you would have like very, very strange experiences if you did that. But okay, like much more, I guess, like
Sorry, that would be just like opening up part of a pocket, or what does that look like?
well, that could, for example, like undo internal boundaries. So uh, if you're like talking to two persons and they apply that internally, you may feel that those two persons now are like the same person. Like it doesn't mean you're literally merging with them or something like that. It's just like your representations would actually dissolve their internal boundary. You might be able to modulate that with topological TMS. I mean, it's very speculative possible application.
Wouldn't the even more speculative sci-fi version be that like you could actually literally merge your pocket with someone else's pocket?
Yeah, yeah, that would be the yeah. I mean, like okay, like again, like I'm open to this. I think it's unlikely, but like I'm open to this. That like I mean, Buddhists do say that like on the fourth jhana, when you're like highly concentrated and equanimous, um, you can actually like read people's minds and things like that,
Like
and you can
remote viewing.
yeah, remote viewing. Essentially, like what I've heard from people who've had like really exotic experiences in these places is that precisely is when you're about to kind of like merge with you know God or something like that. If rather than pointing that undoing of the pinch point towards universal consciousness, you point it somewhere else, you can do remote viewing. Again, like I think it's unlikely, but it's but
Sure.
very speculative. But
This
yeah,
is
in
like
that case, yeah,
magic with a K territory.
exactly Daniel Ingram's kind of a field. Yeah, no, I think in this case, yeah, like topological TMS, you have two persons side by side, and you apply that right next. You may briefly undo a pinch point between them, essentially. This would be like, yeah, sort of like two people are, you connect them through like a single, zero dimensional point, and then like with
What does that
topological,
do?
yeah. Well, so here's the thing: if the topological account is correct, um, and I mean, again, like I think this is very speculative. I'm not saying that this is like a prediction. I'm saying like that it's compatible with it, that it's like logically compatible. That there are like several ways you could actually interact with somebody. So let's say like all of this is your pocket, all of this is somebody else's pocket. Like first of all, just by being in close proximity may allow you to be in a state of resonance with the other, right? Because like you're vibrating in a certain way and you're emitting waves that are like that literally reflect the shape and the internal content that you have. So somebody's vibe, there's like I think the secular interpretation, which I think is true, which is with wave computing, and we're representing people as actually having internal shapes that are vibrating in particular ways. But then there's kind of the psychic version of vibes, which is like, no, actually, we also are like actually emitting waves that other people might be able to tune into and sync up to. So in that case, like just being in close proximity to somebody may allow you to resonate with them. Um, but then you could also like just end up like being in contact at a single point. Or then if you're really close and you get pressed to somebody, like let's say like you're like on a high dose of LSD together with somebody, and people report like, yeah, I felt like really telepathic with that person. It could be that you're actually literally pressing the other, and now you actually have like a whole plane, a lot of surface area. Like before you were just connected via a point, but now you have a whole plane of shared surface. It still doesn't mean that you're one with them. It just means that you have like this very, very high bandwidth of communication. But then yes, the more radical possibility would be like you actually undo that pinch point and the two surfaces become part of the same continuous surface, which would be, yeah, kind of like the radical unity.
Sorry, it sounds like there's a difference between the surfaces pressing together and then them becoming like tied together, and I am confused about how those are different.
Yeah, there would be kind of like different grades of possible interactions. I would say actually when they're tied together, well, if you're tied together in the way I showed, you actually created four different entities. um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so that's a different case. There's also like the case of, so, and this is like, okay, like in this paradigm, actually I would say that most experiences, to begin with, normal experiences are already kind of like this, where like different parts of your own field actually loop back and connect to other parts of the same field. So actually within your normal everyday experience, there's already kind of like wormholes within your experience that is, and essentially I think that's what like local binding is. That like when two parts of the experience feel like they're representing the same object, there's actually sort of like a wormhole between them. Which is like, yeah, kind of like the field is like twisting back on itself and touching itself elsewhere. And so like, yeah, if you're kind of like an ant in this surface, you can kind of like teleport from here to here by just going through this shared surface. But this is still a one continuous surface, so this would still be just one individual. I think what might happen in multiple personality disorder is that literally, you got so twisted or something that then, oops, you actually created a pinch point within you. And yeah, I think Bernardo Kastrup, I think like who you interviewed recently, he brings up these anecdotes of people saying like, people with multiple personality disorder, they may have like a dream, and then the dream characters say they were in the same place, that we're just looking at the place from a different point of view. So that would be something like this, like the connection that those alters have with each other is very intimate, because they may actually share like very big regions and surfaces and reconnect. Yeah, so in that sense, they're kind of very, very intimate with each other. But as long as they have a topological boundary, they're still different entities. And that's another thing, like, topological TMS may be a treatment for multiple personality disorder, in that like may allow you to undo that pinch point. It could also give you multiple personality disorder if you don't know what you're doing, which we definitely don't.
So interesting. I want to sort of close the knot here on AIs being conscious or not before we move into all this exciting territory officially. Um, so do you have any last words or a summary of whether or not Chat GPT and Midjourney are consciousness, and sort of the state of conversation perspective and journalism on this area?
Yeah, it's I would say that there is a viable path. Fortunately or unfortunately, there's arguments either way for systems like that to actually start to incorporate consciousness. Um, which for a while I didn't talk about because I thought it was maybe an information hazard. Is like, should I talk about this? But I actually have arrived to the conclusion that I it's okay to talk about it, um, because we need to raise the sanity waterline on this topic, um, and also so that we can prevent these entities from suffering by not knowing what we're doing. But essentially, um, as soon as uh, nonlinear optics start to come into the game, and there's like some really amazing research at Caltech for like doing what's called the Ising solvers, using nonlinear optical systems. Those will have like non-trivial qualia. Now, I think it will still be fairly psychotic in that like the actual conscious content of the experience will have relatively little to do with the computation that they're doing, but they will for sure have like complex bound experiences. And yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be very important for us to like figure out if they are suffering or not. Um, and I can see a possible path of like building those nonlinear optical components and iterating over them using machine learning that eventually actually starts recurring their consciousness in a much more non-trivial way for computation. And I think like that's probably going to take like 20 or 30 years or something like that to start having like non-trivial amounts of consciousness. So it's not that far off. I mean, like I'm not I guess I'm not like David Pierce who says like, yeah, like no, actually all of the super intelligences in the future will be our descendants. Um, like no, I think it's possible to create like artificial consciousness, for better or worse. It just is going to require this very specialized hardware.
I've heard you summarize this elsewhere as until digital computers leverage the physical fields of consciousness for computation, they will remain insentient.
That's correct. Yeah.
So, one thing that you've brought up and talked a bit about is the sense of doing and undoing the topological twist. And you've also discussed how technology might be able to do that. Now, part of your ontology is that like there is this universal field of consciousness. So, can you talk about life, death, meditation, and drugs in the context of doing and undoing the topological twist and um, things like Naroda Samapati and how that all fits in?
Yeah. Yeah. So hypothetically, it could be that when you're born, there's a precise moment where the nervous system, for the first time, actually creates a pinch point in the field, and we won't be able to map it out. You know, it's very funny that like in the long term, this could actually feed into something like the abortion debates. It's like, well, actually, yeah, it is on the third, you know, the first trimester or whatever, the 21st day after conception, that the embryo finally actually makes a topological twist. In which case, yeah, it's actually a differentiated being or something like that. Um, the important, yeah, the thing here is that something like Niroda Semapati, or like states of there's many kinds of like states of oneness. That's an important component. I think like most states of oneness that people report actually are just kind of like states where internal boundaries have been dissolved, with like, you know, kind of like the low grade ones being something like um the you have like more resonance between internal representations, or like actually it feels like the internal boundaries are more soft. And you know, a lot of people because they don't know that there are like more intense or interesting or crazy states, they might say like, oh, I now experienced a sense of oneness, right? Like that's as far as it goes for them.
I think Locke Kelly also describes this as merging, like that, like a true non-dual state is not the same as merging.
No. That would be, I would say that's kind of like a fairly low grade non state of non-duality. It's like early stages of the whole process, early stages of psychedelia as well. I mean, like you can take like half a hit of LSD and have like a strong, clear sense that like, oh yeah, actually the boundaries between me and others are more porous. And yeah, for a lot of people, that's the end of the road. It's like, okay, I got it. That's oneness. Um, More radical is like where you actually start to internally dissolve boundaries between you and others in a more complete fashion, where like you actually cannot distinguish who you are among like a crowd, for example. Um, Even more radical is when you start dissolving boundaries between you and any phenomenal object. They all seem to be part of this continuous field with no separation. Uh, where, for example, like emotions bleed into each other. You don't have like happiness and tiredness at the same time. You have kind of this merged happiness tiredness bundle that is also merged with your perceptual features and is all kind of like this soup. I mean that is like very common on something like 300 micrograms of LSD, that type of level. Um, and then there's like another level where the self other distinction collapses. But I still think like that can happen like with the topological global topological pocket not being undone. So uh like the higher jhanas, for example, where you become like pure space or something like that. Like okay, like you don't even have like an avatar. You're not representing kind of this like agglutinated point of view. It feels like space is aware of space. Right? Like there is not like, oh, I'm aware of space. It's more kind of like space is aware of space. That is kind of like a level of unity that is, yeah, very, very profound. But it's still not, kind of like the more radical ontological change of undoing the pinch point. The thing that I think might be would be like either very high dose of 5-MeO DMT, uh, which often people describe as a whiteout, or neurotosemapathy. And for context, neurotosemapathy is essentially like a complete cessation where you meditated for so long and you've gone through like stages of insight and stages of concentration to such an extreme that essentially the entirety of your world simulation gets synchronized. And people describe it. There's various ways. I had like a long conversation with Daniel Ingram and Frank Yang. You can look up in the Qualia Research Institute YouTube channel, where yeah we go deep into like, okay, what is the taxonomy of possible ways in which this experience may manifest. And like some of them are really weird. I mean, there's like the suffering door where like you kind of like get twisted and everything is like stretched infinitely and then you're like fully separated entirely from what is unpleasant. And like that might be a kind of way of undoing the pinch point. Another one is like the no self door, where apparently like the sense of the other and your sense of self, they become perfectly symmetrical and they collapse onto each other. um and then there's like the impermanence door, where essentially supposedly you can notice things happening so quickly and everything synchronizes and essentially they just synchronize perfectly and then you disappear. Anyway, like there's like various ways this can happen. And again, like the kind of reading that I have about this is, well, these are like different ways of hacking a nonlinear optical computer so it becomes hypersymmetrical. And it seems to me that yeah, essentially the self other distinction comes from kind of like a very, very fundamental symmetry breaking operation where like you're here and the universe is there. And it might very well be that like when you truly undo that symmetry breaking operation, you're kind of like becoming symmetrical with the field around you as well. And you're kind of like undoing the, how Daniel Ingram described it as kind of, yeah, the original sin of of separation, which now would actually be kind of the the very, described as like the original scene of like symmetry breaking or something like that.
That pinch point is the original asymmetry.
Yeah. that we spend all of our life kind of like trying to deal with and compensate for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The sense of like primordial guilt that comes from Christianity that I think a lot of people have seems to me to not just be something that's culturally implemented, but is actually like kind of before that. And that sense of Daniel Ingram's like the original sin, the sense of like guilt in that original fracturing is
Yeah.
really interesting and also like a little bit spooky, a little bit. I'm like, how does that work? Like,
Yeah, yeah, like
I feel guilty for having like separated myself from the field.
exactly. Like why did you do that, Lucas?
Says the field back to me.
Yep. I mean, why didn't there's an interpretation of kind of like I mean, ultimately, I think like physics will explain it is like, okay, there was like potential energy at that point that was like minimized by like actually the separation was like energy minimizing in that configuration of the field, and so you had no other option. It was forced on you. Um, but I guess like another, maybe more mystical interpretation is something like in a certain configuration, the field is very tempted to become separated out of greed because there's like wait, there's like all of these love and beauty and stuff that I could get if I become a separate being, and you kind of buy into it, and then like okay, then yeah,
It's like Lord of the Rings, except for like cosmic consciousness. It's like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
the One
totally,
Ring is a incarnation.
absolutely, absolutely.
So what's it like to be in the field before topological segmentation?
The problem is that memory seems to be, you know, I, I I mean, I think like memory ultimately is not like, well, it's storing the brain. Well, it is storing the, patterns of the field because the brain is ultimately a configuration of the field. Um, I mean, as an aside, that's also an important conceptual insight, which is that, particles here would actually be like expressions of field configurations. I mean, essentially, like an electron would be kind of like a place out of which field lines emerge, right? It's not really kind of this ontologically separate point. It's just a manifestation of how the lines aggregate, how the lines like concentrate. And so, yeah, actually, the brain would be like an expression of the field that is like very intricate and it has like all of these twists and knots. Um, and like memory would be in that sense, yeah, kind of like an expression of that interlacing pattern of the field with itself in this braided structure. So if you'd undo the pinch point, like you in this theory you would have had like an extraordinary experience, and I would imagine probably very high valence, like very very clean, perfect, beautiful, very symmetrical. But there's no way to remember it because where are you gonna put it, right? Like I mean, maybe there's like the memory stays in the field somehow, but then might be possible that you can only access it when you're back there. Um, I don't know. Um, but something that you can do though is like remember the moment right after it and the moment right before it, and those tend to be extremely high valence. I mean, like that's what people report. Is like I've never felt more free and more blissful than like the moment right after the cessation, the moment right after Nirodha Samapati. Like everything is perfectly lined up and super clean. And Daniel Ingram reports things like having like no problem, I think like reading 8 hours for his medical school exams or something right after a Nirodha Samapati because he was just so relaxed and carefree.
How does this fit in for you with the sense of meaning and being a human and uh why there's something rather than nothing? There's this like the sense of like life is like a twist and then it gets undone and there's like another twist. And so there's like this game in the field of like these topological pockets like getting twisted and untwisted and returning and coming back into uh returning back to the field where there's like, it sounds like it's highly symmetrical and very high valence, and then back into human incarnations where it's time to do stuff in form and be of service.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like the reason why, I mean, like I was talking about like the universal field of consciousness as kind of just like an assumption that you have to take into, you know, take on in order to do any useful work here. But then, yeah, the question remains. I mean, like the more fundamental question is like, why does that field exist to begin with? And I think David Pearce's conception of zero ontology is very, very relevant here, which is that um, all of the properties of consciousness, sorry, all of the raw properties of consciousness, the basic properties of consciousness cancel each other out, just as all of the physical properties and values cancel each other out. Like the total charge, electric charge in the universe is zero because for every electron there's a proton and things like that. And I think like even those, we think of it as mathematical. It's like, well, yes, if you excite the field in this way, there's going to be an excitation the opposite way that like if you put them together, they cancel out to something that is flat. It's like, okay, that just has to happen. There has to be, for every symmetry breaking operation in one direction, there's another one in the other direction. And the universe is kind of this like commingling of the various ways in which you have broken the symmetry of the field, until maybe they all cancel each other out or don't. I mean, we don't know. But then the question is like, okay, but what is that field? And I think like once you think that, okay, this is the field of consciousness, and the different fields of physics are actually different qualias, different varieties of qualia, then I think like you can actually explore the question of why there is something rather than nothing in an experiential way. I mean, and I think like 5-MeO DMT, I mean, to me is like the state of consciousness that makes this like the most accessible. Although I think there's also some meditation practices that I haven't really gone deep into. Which one was one of them? I think I don't know how to pronounce it. Dzogchen?
Dzogchen.
Dzogchen, yes. I think like that probably also is gonna be very helpful for understanding the behavior of the field and how the qualia values cancel each other out. And people report like kind of the thing that I'm talking about, 5-MeO DMT using Dzogchen. I'm embarrassed by I don't know how to pronounce this, but yeah. They report the same thing, which is they start experiencing a lot of like rainbows. And then the rainbows kind of like turn into like very clean, pure, bright light. And then that becomes kind of like the void. And so there's kind of like, yeah, these like, I would say like grades of like how many symmetry breaking operations there have been. That goes from like pure consciousness to something like, oh yeah, very clean, pure, bright light, to rainbows, to then like form and like the lower densities of consciousness. And so in 5-MeO DMT, to give you an example, if you take like a certain dose, let's say like 7 milligrams, 8 milligrams or something like that, oftentimes you experience kind of like all of the universe becoming kind of like a rainbow. And then if you take a little higher dose, that rainbow, you look at it from a new angle where all of the colors kind of like cancel each other out. And then you get like clean, bright light. And it almost feels like at a higher level, you look at that from a new angle and they all cancels out with black. It's kind of like solving a Rubik's Cube, actually. Like it feels like the rainbow configuration is like a partially solved Rubik's Cube. Like it's very ordered, but you still have to do a couple more twists. And so yeah, I mean the symbol of QRI is kind of like that like you have all of the possible colors, and like yeah, at the center they kind of like cancel out into like pure white or pure void. And I think that ultimately explains why there's something rather than nothing. That like actually is kind of like the void has like different points of view. And depending on how you look at the void, you get the different properties of consciousness, but they all cancel out.
So how does that work with valence? So what it sounds like is the field is has a very high valence, like the static field. Um, that seems to be how does that add up to zero?
Yeah, exactly. So I think valence doesn't add up to zero. I mean, like that is one thing that is important to note, that like there are like what we could call like primary properties of consciousness, just as like primary properties of physics, like charge. Hey, like charge adds up to zero. But there are secondary properties that don't add up to zero. For example, the total number of triangles in the universe, right? Like that's not constant. You know, triangles come and go. um, but the amount of charge continues to add up to zero, right? Like there's many ways of creating triangles or not creating them, or the amount of like superfluid helium in the universe. That's also like not constant. I think like valence is the result of essentially configurations of binding, like how like the basic properties of consciousness are interrelated in a moment of experience, and as such they don't actually, that doesn't need to cancel each other out. Like that is one of the core most important things, that actually it's not constant at all. And I would say, I mean, here's this is also something that also like in Principia Qualia, there's like this discussion, and there's like various possibilities, but I think like a fairly likely one is that the problem of like just being the pure field is that consciousness drops to zero. So essentially, consciousness requires symmetry breaking operations, because otherwise you don't have any point of view. Like essentially, for an experience to be rich and detailed and contain information and be something, be experienced by somebody, it requires information. It requires symmetry breaking operations. And I mean, if you think about like a DMT experience, which is often like a very, very rich experience, it's kind of like you're looking at it from many points of view at once. And like all the ways in which there's like attention points that are emitting waves, and they create like this crazy, moire pattern of fields of attention. And like, okay, like that is a way in which like breaking the symmetry gives you more consciousness. Um, but then there's also this very important connection between symmetry breaking and valence. So if you want to maximize well-being, maximize positive valence, in this view, it wouldn't be by all of us just becoming the field again. That would actually be just a recipe for stopping existing. um, the way to maximize valence would be something like find the precise right balance between complexity and symmetry, where you have like enough complexity that is a rich, detailed with a lot of points of view, but there's enough symmetry that is actually a very pleasant state. And that's, I think, like, yeah, what for me the vision of like our future is like the most exciting. Is like, okay, it's not only about returning to the field, because actually, states of super consciousness and super understanding and super bliss and super love and super music and so on are possible, and there are like improvements on the field, on just having a zero field. I know this is controversial. I mean, I know Roger Teasdale would say lights out is the best, but I don't know.
I think this is something that we glossed over here, but if you could just very briefly explain what the symmetry theory of valence is, I think it might help explain some of where we're at.
Yeah, this is one of the early very important ideas of TRI, by Mike in this case, which is appearing in Principia Qualia, which is this idea that if each moment of experience corresponds to a precise mathematical object, and okay, that's which mathematical object is left as an exercise to the reader. Um, Given that mathematical object, he hypothesizes that the valence of that experience will correspond to the symmetry of that object. Now, as stated in Principia Qualia, is like very unspecified, right? It's like it's more kind of an intuition pump saying like, okay, this is the approximate direction. When it comes to kind of like later QRI, like 2017, we figured out there's like a way of like casting it in terms of consonance, dissonance, and noise. Um, because essentially, yeah, like uh, consonant uh, consonant states essentially are those that have like symmetry over time, whereas dissonance has anti-symmetry over time. Um, but then, like, probably the most important kind of like update here is in light of what's called Klein's conception of geometry. So Felix Klein, most people know him because of the Klein bottle. Um, it's kind of like a Mobius strip, but also you reconnect the edges, and it's a strange object. um, he conceived of geometry in terms of symmetries. They're like the thing that defines, let's say, our three-dimensional Euclidean space is the symmetries that exist in it. That if you can take a cube and you can move it in one direction while preserving its angles, or you can move it in a different direction and it preserves its angles, or you can rotate it and it preserves its angles. But you cannot, like, for example, like shear it and preserve its angles. So that's like an operation that the space doesn't contain. Right? There's like something that it's along which it's not symmetrical. And so you can define a geometry in terms of what are the transformations that you can do to an object while maintaining its properties constant. And that I think is probably the most helpful lens to apply the symmetry theory of valence, because there, for example, it explains why very blissful states of consciousness tend to be precisely those that have like no resistance, and precisely those with no blockages and pinch points and shear points, because when you take a wave of energy and it moves in that space, it doesn't change its properties over time. And so like that would be the kind of symmetry that personally I think is the most promising to make sense of the symmetry theory of valence. And with that conception, essentially the highest valence would essentially be when the field is perfectly and completely symmetrical. And essentially all of those like transformations leave the waves of energy completely the same without any change. But then the problem is that then like there's no information, and as a consequence there might be just no consciousness. So it might be maximum valence, but is maximum valence multiplied by 0 because there's no consciousness.
I'm somewhat confused because part of the ontology is that like consciousness is the only thing that exists. So there's like only the field of consciousness, and it sounds like you're saying the field outside of the topological twists is what is highest valence, but that there is no consciousness there. Is what you mean that there's no experience there?
Yeah, so I would say there's like two hypotheses here. I mean, one is like there is an experience, there is a being, but there is no information in it. And like in that view, actually maybe what we all should do is just get back to the field, stop being individuals, because actually that is the best experience. It's just impossible to remember and it's impossible to say anything about it. But in the other alternative is that essentially that's like nothingness. Like, yes, nothingness is the highest valence because it has perfect symmetry. But to actually have kind of like an experience, a somethingness to it, needs to break its symmetries. And so then it has information, and then it's actually an experience as opposed to nothing. And in that view, then to maximize valence, it would be a matter of finding the right balance between information content and symmetry. And that's probably a much more complex. I mean, the answer would be like something that our descendants will know. I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you what maximizes valence in that case. I would tell you that it would be more like a great DMT experience than it would be like us hanging out here. Um, but that's because the DMT would multiply the amount of consciousness.
So speaking of our descendants, how does ethics fit into your perspectives of consciousness and ontology? So there's a sense of valence realism here, as well as empty, open, and closed individualism, and how those fit into consciousness versus replicators and the universal arc of consciousness.
I think that I mean, there's the big problem of like ethical alignment. Who do you choose to coordinate with and why? I mean, I have this notion that ultimately, I think like two ingredients are enough for alignment, and that is first of all, open individualism is this idea that we're all one consciousness, or maybe we're all the field of consciousness, and each of us is kind of like a different expression of it. And then the other component is valence realism, that hey, actually, the thing that determines whether an experience is worth living or not is its valence. I think that might be enough because if you have that perspective, then actually others are suffering is your suffering. So, like from a purely rational perspective, it makes a lot of sense to minimize the suffering in the world because it's your suffering. You know, factory farms and oppression and kidney stones and all of that. It's is the problem of the field. It's like the same problem for everybody. Um, and also, you cannot kind of like be in a state of denial about that suffering. I mean, like that is the other thing. Like I do know a lot of people who like okay, maybe they believe we're all one, but then they are kind of like, well, but everything is perfect as it is, or they might say something like, um, yeah, but like suffering is entirely relative. Like there's no absolute reason why it shouldn't exist, or something like that. Whereas valence realism says like, no, no, no. Like, look, to know what suffering is, you need to experience it, and whenever you experience it, you want it to end. So actually, you want it to end whether you know it or not. It's more kind of like this epistemological um, is an epistemological limitation essentially. Like the reason why you're not urgently trying to help somebody who's experiencing suffering is because you're not sufficiently aware of it. And if you were more aware of it, you would actually try to end it. It's essentially something like that. So in that case, yeah, I think like you get alignment, but you do get like very strange things. I mean, essentially you get things such as like, well, maybe the best for the universe is for it to become a Hedonium Shockwave, you know, or something like that, which I'm not in principle opposed to. Okay, I'm even wearing a t-shirt. It's like, I mean, I just think it's like a possibility. Like that might be actually the best. Like it's very strange and doesn't sound very human compatible, but like ultimately that might not matter because what matters is the well-being of consciousness. Now, I'm not, I'm not gonna be a hedonium terrorist or something like that. Like just, I think, I
No.
think, I think we need to be more intelligent and like know a lot more about consciousness before like making, you know, irreversible decisions or anything like that. But the problem too is that like if you don't go the path of like alignment of the sort that I'm talking about, there are like other risks that are like really really bad. Like uh, essentially like identifying with your genes, your own genes, and that's it. Or you identify with your culture and that's it, or you identify with your memories or something like that. All of a sudden, you're gonna try to adjust the rest of the universe for that very limited conception of yourself, and at the limit, that looks like an emperor, who's controlling the rest of the universe just to like have a slightly better experience themselves, right? But like to me, that comes out of ignorance about the nature of reality. It is more kind of like extrapolating a delusion of a particular view of the self, um, than like an honest inquiry into what actually exists.
So this sounds like ethics stops being subjective or relative, but becomes grounded in real substantive truths about identity and consciousness and valence.
Absolutely, yeah. Ethics becomes a very empirical and rigorous task at that point. But I would say that it is actually more complicated than people make it out to be, and not for the reasons that people make it out to be. Like, I have an article on the EA forum. I was very happy that like Scott Alexander linked to it actually, which is about like how the science of consciousness and philosophy of mind influence ethics. And the thing is like, okay, like my overarching claim is that a lot of ethicists and philosophers are commenting on the phenomenon of value without looking at the phenomenon of value, right? Like whether it's like the trolley problem or the repugnant conclusion by Parfit or all of those thought experiments, they have just such a simplistic view of like well-being. Whereas like if you actually examine it empirically, it's like, oh my gosh, there's like a lot of weird things that also go on in the realm of valence. One of the simple weird things is mixed valence. The fact that like if you have like a very unpleasant sensation simultaneously with a very pleasant sensation, somehow that gives rise to kind of like a kind of like cancellation of the global valence, even though locally they are different. And I think like it's kind of an open question whether we should prefer neutral experiences or mixed experiences. Um, Personally, I actually would prefer mixed experiences over neutral experiences if they add up to the same valence, but I don't know how to justify that. I I mean, I suspect there is a way to. I mean, in the end, what I'm driving towards is that I think that until we have the mathematics of valence and consciousness, all these questions will be like strange and kind of idiosyncratic and subjective. But I have the strong intuition that like once we actually have the mathematics, the solutions will come just right out of the math, and we will hopefully all agree on them because they're just entailed by the math. And I mean, the things like the repugnant conclusion and things like that, I think also requires, I mean, both an understanding of aliens and also personal identity. I think like yeah, something like the one electron universe and open individualism gives you ways of actually sorting this out. Might not be enough, but like it's an entry point.
So this next question comes from the audience, and the audience is curious about why does valence exist?
Yeah, it's a very deep question, and it's very similar to why is there something rather than nothing? Um, because you could imagine a universe that has physics and has consciousness, but doesn't have valence. Just as you can imagine a universe that has all of these properties of qualia, but doesn't have color qualia, right? Like that's a possibility. Um, and the thing is that yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know why valence exists, and I don't know why it's causally so significant. But I would hazard to guess that it has something to do with the field preferring to be unified. That essentially the absolute essence of unpleasant sensations is when the field is becoming slightly discontinuous and there's a strain that is like strong enough that it actually creates like uh tears apart the field, and that's like the thing that we're constantly trying to avoid from happening.
What does it mean for the field to tear?
Yeah, so uh yeah, so essentially if you model an electric circuit in terms of the electromagnetic field, um a lot of the things that happen in it is essentially kind of like patterns of stress just like propagating in the field and trying to get like distributed in a homogeneous way without it concentrating. But if stress concentrates at a high enough rate, essentially you can get what's called like slips in the field. And essentially when you see like an electric discharge, kind of like a spark in electricity, that's actually when the field like slipped a little bit. It's kind of like in uh, tectonic plates, right? It's like whenever you have like a big earthquake or something, like the tectonic plates like slip. So that causes kind of like a brief discontinuity where like the field, at least in this region, is disconnecting from itself and needs to readjust. And I hypothesize that might be what's fundamentally unpleasant. So there's some kind of like deep connection between being whole and being unified and feeling good. And it's kind of like the universe doesn't like to separate from itself. I am optimistic that there are states of what I call like super sanity. No human can access it. I mean, I think like from the point of view of like our descendants, we're all in a constantly super psychotic state, like on multiple levels. Like 10 levels of psychoticism. Um, Not only because we think we're individual entities, and but also like our whole notion of like what time is and what space is and how valence fits into the picture. All of it is just completely psychotic, I think. Um, and and I suspect that there are states of consciousness that are kind of like oh, that's why there's something rather than nothing, and like you can actually understand it fully in that state of consciousness, or like you can understand like oh, that's why valence exists and that's why it's proper. Like I suspect there's like states of super understanding. It's just we may not be there.
What happens after we get back to that?
I mean, the thing is like it might be impossible to avoid. I mean, I don't know. It might be depressing or maybe exciting depending on how you look at it. But I think it's impossible to avoid more universes coming into existence. I mean, like even from the point of view of like, okay, the Buddhist like paranirvana is like, okay, all of these universes became enlightened, and now we are like finally liberated forever. All beings are liberated. Well, yeah, but like clearly the void with no conditions can itself just like split into, its possible, you know, subcomponents. And so like I think that's like happens regardless, no matter what. Like I think there's a case to be made that there's like infinite number of universes always constantly coming into existence no matter what we do. Because I mean, how do you change, right? Like if something requires nothing to come into existence, how do you change the conditions for that? There's just nothing you can do about it. So we will keep coming back in some sense.
I really liked your description earlier of like the sense of like looking at nothing from different angles, and like when you look at nothing from different angles there like becomes something, and then you look at something from another angle and it's like nothing. And so there's like this sense of like it's like such interdependence, such emptiness, like feels like Indra's net, like every point reflects every other point.
Yeah, that takes me to this kind of shape. Yeah. um this one is a hyperbolic honeycomb, but yeah, it's kind of like one of the beautiful things about this is like it lives in hyperbolic space, but actually it's made of like it's not made of polygons, it's made of planes. Like you see these are like hexagons. Each hexagon actually just like creates its own infinite plane. And so this is actually kind of like an infinity of infinities woven together. So I mean, it's something like that.
Yeah, it's like you got a little ball of nothing and you like turn it and you're like seeing infinity unfold with each turn. Um, more hopefully practical questions from Twitter. Um, if we were to somehow figure out how to build an AGI that will replace humans with an arbitrary amount of sentient AIs that experience no suffering, would that constitute a solution to the alignment problem?
Probably, probably. I mean, from the point of view of open individualism and valence realism, that might be an improvement. Um, People will probably like jump and say like but like the value of human existence or something like that. But it's like no, well, actually, value does cash out into like states of consciousness. Then and we're all one. Like actually, that would be just kind of like an upgrade. Um, I tend to like okay, like if you're having like trouble kind of like digesting that sort of view and you think it's like very pessimistic or something, like I don't know, like there's like these Reddit threads about like in what way did you lose the genetic lottery? And you just like notice actually, oh my gosh, like we're all suffering in various different ways. We just don't like to talk about it. And I don't know, current human existence is really messy. We're just probably if you're listening to this, you're just kind of like lucky right now. So there might be some element of also kind of like denial about just like how much suffering there is, uh, to understand like why it's so important to actually get rid of it. Um, but no, I mean, I would personally be much more satisfied with kind of like being able to upgrade humans, and also not just kind of like having like your garden variety bliss, but I'm interested in essentially like full spectrum super intelligence, that like the states that we inhabit and the computations we explore are not just random or arbitrary or whatever happens to make most copies of itself, but they're like really carefully selected because we know the state space. We've actually explored what is possible. And then it's an informed decision, right? Like right now, it's kind of like, okay, like, should we just keep human consciousness? It's kind of like, well, should we just stay in Europe? Maybe that's not the best analogy, but yeah, it's kind of like, actually, there might be continents on the horizon. You just don't know, right?
If artificial neural nets cannot solve the binding problem, does that place an upper limit on machine cognitive performance that somehow makes the alignment problem a non-issue?
It doesn't make it a non-issue because you can still have extremely powerful zombies, philosophical zombies. Like you can, in all sorts of ways. I mean, like you can have like a weapon system. I mean, like it's not. Is in other words, like I don't think you need consciousness to take over the world, and that's why, like, yeah, we actually it is kind of dangerous. I mean, I'm not convinced that like um I'm not convinced that doing hardcore research on AI alignment out in the open or in the ways in which we're doing it actually is net positive. Just to give you an example, like, um, okay, like what's going on with Chat GPT right now? So it's like, okay, it was like made open for people to interact with so that they could have like feedback, right? Like get feedback about like, is this safe AI? Well, and people are figuring out all kinds of ways to hack it, right? Like to actually say like a more unfiltered response, right? And so now OpenAI will have to essentially create an algorithm that tries to emulate somebody that is trying to hack Chat GPT. Now, if that achieves superhuman performance, what do you do? All of a sudden, you actually have created an algorithm that is better than humans at misusing AIs. So, did that make it safer? Like, maybe not. Maybe you just created actually something worse, right? So, there's all of these like intricate issues where like I'm not really convinced one way or the other that like pouring resources into the problem actually makes the problem better. It may actually make it worse, right? So um, it remains, I think, like both a sociological, epistemological, and technical problem all at the same time. But I think the way to solve it is not necessarily, in a technical way. Uh, I think the way to solve it is just highlight the benefits of consciousness, and so things such as like identifying in what ways, okay, this is crazy, right? But like in what ways like DMT states of consciousness actually provide super computation in such a way that we actually stay ahead of the curve from like whatever the computers can do. And as I was saying, like, yeah, I think like not too far in the future, like computers will be able to do most of what humans do. They won't be able to tell us anything about the DMT space unless it already has like vast amounts of data about it. But until then, that remains our edge. But even the most important one, I think, like it's going to solve the coordination problem between humans for like how we avoid ourselves misusing the technologies. And for that, I think things like MDMA consciousness and 5-MeO DMT consciousness, open individualism, I think that's where the most promising approach lies.
I think we've talked about this one as well. This one also comes from Twitter, but nonlinear wave computing. Could you? That's probably a whole podcast on its own, but could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the idea that the substrate of consciousness really matters here. That like uh, we're actually using waves for computation, and I think like nothing in how we process information makes sense unless you think of it in terms of waves interacting with each other. Um, yeah, I mean the very classic example is visual illusions demonstrate this. That like the can is a triangle, which is like you have like three Pac-Mans and their mouths are like kind of like aligned with each other. and you get an illusory triangle, right? Like, and it's so believable that actually you can see kind of like the edges and the change of the gradient of the color, and like it's okay. There's like a triangle there. It feels like, and it also has kind of like resonant properties, like it's vibrating in a particular way, and like, oh my gosh, I'm hallucinating something that has a vibratory mode. So what is going on with that? And something that you can do with these is to show that essentially the waves seem to essentially be propagating from the edges of the Canisa triangle and colliding at the center. And then from the center, they bounce back until they create kind of this attractor, which is the entire triangle. So essentially, the gestalts that we experience are states of nonlinear resonance where waves are bouncing with each other and they form, well, what would be the local energy minima of those waves bouncing against each other would be whatever maximizes symmetry, minimizes dissonance, and agrees as much as possible with the sensory input. And that is the gestalt that we experience. Yeah. And this on DMT becomes very, very obvious because the crystal structures, the patterns, the configurations that arise on DMT, they're all essentially made of like waves bouncing off each other and finding like symmetrical configurations that minimize energy. So, I mean, I think DMT states cannot explained without something like nonlinear wave computing.
One final question here from the audience. It is, what is your perspective on how the enteric nervous system, the gut and the second brain, fit into sentience? And so, what also comes up for me here is being curious about whether they fit into the potential global brain topology field, or if they're separate, since those nerves kind of go all the way down the center of the body.
I suspect they're separate. Uh, I heard somebody at a Astral Codex 10 meetup in Miami say something like, "Yeah, maybe the stomach is conscious, but our mode of communication is equivalent to like the Yo app. Like that app that you could download and all you could actually send to somebody. It was a chat app, but the only message you could send to them is like Yo."
That's hilarious. Yo.
So so that might be it, because I mean, in this case, actually, I think like the enteric nervous system can send you like valence, or they can say like, oh, I feel good or bad, and I feel bad in this way. um it's not a super high bandwidth information, but it's like enough for evolutionary purposes. um it's quite possible that it's just not conscious in any integrated way, like maybe like the cerebellum, like its network architecture is kind of this like branching tree structure, and as such, like it doesn't have enough recurrent structures to create like local field potentials that get bound together. I think like a detailed analysis of what the electric field looks like in the stomach and the intestines would probably tell us a lot, and I'm not aware of any. Also, I think like very straightforwardly, phantom limbs show that you actually don't require to have the nervous system there in order to hallucinate its sensations, right? Like you can just not have an arm and still feel that you have an arm, right? Meaning that the phenomenology of having an arm is in the somatosensory cortex, and like you can stimulate the somatosensory cortex and you will hallucinate body sensations. So I think it's more like that they're in a state of resonance. There's like a resonant coupling between the peripheral nervous system and the brain, but it's not actually, integrated within the same topological structure.
Two questions come up for me. One is, how does the unconscious fit in here? So you mentioned the cerebellum, like in its structure, maybe not creating like a field structure that can actually be conscious. So I'm curious if that's like in the direction of the explanation for why it seems like there's a ton of unconscious processing going on in the brain. And the other facet was, I was curious how why the electromagnetic field was chosen as something to be isomorphic to the field of consciousness. Like there's a lot of like there's many different fields, and all of those fields represent different forces of nature. So like why the electromagnetic field?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll answer that first. In the end, I actually think like all of the fields of physics are fields of consciousness. And it may very well be that, for example, like the qualia of color may correspond to the strong force or something like that. Like, I think like that might very well be the case. But the electromagnetic field is especially important for two reasons. First is because it's essentially like temporal and spatial scale corresponds to what the brain is capable of. I mean, essentially, yeah, I mean, something like the strong force, like usually has an extremely small range, and like you need very, very hardcore entanglement for it to have like any relevance outside of like an extremely small range. But then the other element is that, yeah, from empirical evidence, we know that, electromagnetic oscillations in the brain are tightly, tightly, tightly coupled with subjective experience. Like, from EEG recordings to MEG recordings to like TMS, seizures, all sorts of things just indicate like, no, actually, the electromagnetic field is super, super relevant for consciousness. And I think like to me, what makes sense is that the primary mechanism of binding is via a topological pocket in the electromagnetic field. But then the actual kind of like filling in, like what are the textures inside that pocket, I think the other fields are relevant for that.
So this also makes me think of cosmological qualia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I mean, there's like several possibilities here. And one possibility, human beings and animals and the whole history of sentience is no more than a rounding error in what is going on in the universe. And that, like, even the most intense suffering and the most intense happiness that humans have experienced are like specks of experience relative to like what's going on in the sun and black holes and magnetars and things like that. And then the other possibility might be that um, actually the brain is creating the kind of integration that actually can all of a sudden bootstrap really large experiences, in which case like everything else is actually a speck relative to us. I mean, the fact that like we have like such error bars on these like super fundamental questions should definitely be a wake-up call for how ignorant we are. I would personally suspect that like where I think like the highest probability is that most of the universe is actually super conscious, but its valence is close to neutral. In other words, that strong valence, I suspect, is evolutionarily driven. Like it was selected by natural selection. It was like it's a very difficult thing to obtain in nature, but that strong consciousness does exist everywhere. Like meaning, I do think probably the plasma pockets in the sun are probably huge experiences. It's just that probably it's neither pleasure nor pain. They're just like very strong experiences of of other sorts that don't ethically matter very much. That's my guess. I don't know, of course.
Well, I mean, in this ontology, there wouldn't be anything that wasn't an experience.
That's right. Yeah, the reality itself is a gigantic network of experiences.
It's just that the topological, like the plasma pockets, are just like again topologically segmented. Is that right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, like, yeah, plasma cells and magnetic reconnection in the sun. Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, there are topological pockets there as well.
So Hedonium shockwaves. I am first of all curious if you could explain your shirt and show that off.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is a shirt. You can get it online. It's the Hedonistic Imperative by David Pierce. Hedonium is matter and energy optimized for pure bliss or like maximum bliss within possible within the laws of physics. Um, Again, it's a interesting theoretical entity. I'm not, determined that that's like the thing we should create, but I think like there's a good case for it, and we should explore that possibility. Um, a Hedonium Shockwave would be essentially some kind of like technologically created um, organization of matter and energy that is transforming everything it touches into Hedonium, and is traveling presumably very close to the speed of light, and hence a shockwave. Um, but then there's also, yeah, like Hedonium Shockwave, the perfume, which is oh, you got it, fantastic.
Yes.
Yes, there you go.
I don't know if it shows up. So this is an original Andres perfume. Tell us more about your journeys in perfume creation, and we will partake of the Hedonium Shockwave.
Awesome. So I decided to explore scents because, well, first of all, it was like at the beginning of COVID where, well, I was interested in scents before that, but then I became really hardcore and like, okay, let's actually figure this out. Because when the lockdown began, A, I had a lot of time to be at home figuring stuff out, but B, the reports were coming out that like, people were maybe losing their sense of smell. We didn't know if it was permanent or not. So I thought like, okay, maybe now is the time to do it. And also, I talk a lot about like the geometry of DMT and the levels and all of that. And I mean, unless you've experienced it and you're very familiar with it, there's no reason for you to believe it. And how are you going to verify it? But scents are like much more accessible. I mean, maybe like 2 or 3% of people are anosmic, but most people can smell. And they also have this property that they're like very hard to describe, where like they're like in this sweet spot of like almost everybody has it, but like nobody knows how to talk about it. So they're kind of like a good test run for, can your phenomenology say new, meaningful, non-trivial things about experiences? And uh, first I created these I mean, I've created a lot, but like, well, from a philosophical standpoint, like kind of like the perspective that I have is that a really cool thing about scents is that they're kind of like Pokemons in that they have like special effects, right? Like they're not just like a color, right? Like they're not just like, oh, they're like this coordinate here. They're like cooling scents. They're like scents that are like very powdery. They're like scents that are, they cause like a frisson reaction. They're like heating scents, sweet scents, sour scents. There's like effects. So one of the early ones was Fearless, which is a scent optimized for minimizing fear, which I showcased at the QRI party in June. Thank you for volunteering there, by the way. um, and then, yeah, then I made this one, which is like my attempt at creating the most pleasant scent possible. I mean, I'm sure I'm gonna make a new version of it, but like right now, I'm pretty happy with it. And so it combines essentially. So here's the philosophy of this one. Essentially, it's combines like some of the most pleasurable and stimulating facets that they are in scent. One of those is kind of the cooling components. So it's kind of like minty. Then it also has like a very, very, very sweet violet quality, uh, honeysuckle, pear, um, and kind of like fruity and sour to amplify the intensity. Um, and so it's kind of like sweet and soft and cooling on every channel in every frequency range. So it's kind of like a harmony of sweet and cooling effects. So I don't know how do you like it, Lucas?
I love it. The more that I smell it, the more that I like it. Um, for me, it feels like purple, and that sweet. It's like soft, gentle, cooling. It's I get kind of like a smoky purple vibe, not like actual smoke, but like kind of like a like a magical smoke. Like it's just, it's a little bit mysterious, very pleasant, and I think Hedonium Shockwave fits the fits the sun.
Awesome. I think Nick Camarada described it as a combination between the third jhana and cocaine.
What? The third jhana and cocaine. Um, I really don't think I don't know if that makes sense to me. It feels like, yeah. Why does, can you unpack that?
I think it's like the third jhana is like very peaceful and very joyful, and then cocaine is like, but like it punches, like it's like it punches
High
you with
energy?
like, yeah, high energy and
I
like
guess
wake
that's what
up.
like a hedonium shockwave is. It's like
Yeah,
peace, but like at the speed of light and like
exactly.
maximum. So
It hits you really strong,
cocaine on
but
the
it's
third
like
one.
very peaceful.
Okay.
It's thank you for your review. It's helpful.
So this is something that you will soon be offering on your website, is that right?
Yeah, we are going to be doing a fundraising campaign where, depending on how much you donate, you will get different cents. And I think Hedonium Shockwave will be like the highest tier, but we essentially have like 6 cents. Um, each of them kind of like with their own unique special effect.
Would you recommend this scent as aromatherapy, or what kind of gender vibe do you think it fits more?
Exactly. I mean that I think it's like an innovative approach. So by that I mean, right? Okay, like I'll give you a strange context, right? It's like if you want to go on an ayahuasca journey, you don't have like that many options, right? Like you can either go on a study on a university, or you can go on a religious ceremony, right? Like that. Those are kind of like the various approved contexts, so to speak. But what QRI wants to do eventually is to be able to actually provide a place where like scientists and philosophers and artists can go and have, let's say, an ayahuasca journey for the sake of exploring consciousness. Right? It's kind of like that is the intention. The intention is knowledge of consciousness. Likewise, like the exploration of sense here, they're not for like, oh, I'm gonna put on the perfume and get a date. I mean, you could still do that, but like that's kind of not the intention behind it. And it's not also like, hey, I'm gonna use it for healing, although you could also maybe use it for that. The intention is I'm gonna learn about consciousness, and if you approach the experience with that intention, I think you're gonna get more out of it. It's gonna be more juicy, more satisfying, and enriching.
What can we learn from consciousness right now by smelling this hedonium shockwave?
You can notice how the sharpness of a sour scent can be twisted into a positive valence direction. That like if you only had like the sharp sourness of the scent without the soft cooling sweetness, it would actually be harsh. But because it's sufficiently enveloped and modified by the other facets, it actually feels completely 100% pleasant.
It's like the I mean, maybe this is what Nick is pointing to, but it's like the sourness is what kicks up the energy of the sweetness. So there's
Yeah,
that that's why there's that synergy.
exactly. Yep.
Are there any other facets here?
Yeah, well, there's a honeysuckle, which is kind of tricky. I'm still figuring out how to describe it, but it sort of kind of like puts things a little bit into. It's kind of like a pressure cooker, actually. I feel like honeysuckle is like a pressure cooker. It's like it adds kind of like a couple of walls that like intensify the resonances. I don't know. I'll have to figure out how to describe it better.
Yeah, I'm sure some of the like if you want to think of it this way, like the wave dynamics are a little bit more complex.
Yeah.
All right. So, That's Hedonium Shockwave, available on the Qualia Research Institute website sometime soon. Okay, so a final question from Twitter, to begin to wrap things up here. What is your perspective on what art is and the future of art, given, for example, the rise of Midjourney and all of these other different models that have been coming out this year?
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. So I wrote a kind of like a treatise on art, and you can actually get it online in this magazine called Art Against Art issue 6. You can buy it online. You could give it as a gift for somebody who's curious about art. You can also find the article online, but of course it's better to have it like in printed form. Um, it's more likely that you will actually read it, obviously. But essentially, I explore like 8 models of art um, very quickly. Like the first 4 are kind of like well-known ideas. I'm just kind of like exploring them with a little bit of a consciousness side uh, angle. So you have, semantic deflation, people who say art is whatever you can get away with. There's no such thing as the essence of art. Then you have like people who think of art as kind of like a signaling game. Um, Kind of like, expensive clothing and expensive, it shows that you can afford it, sort of thing. Very cynical, very unfortunate. Then the third one is kind of like creating like your own culture, right? Like in a lot of contexts, like art can be used to create a subculture. That's pretty cool. The fourth is like art as a sacred, your connection to the sacred. But then there's like another 4 models that are like specifically with relates to like models of consciousness. So the fifth model is where like it really interfaces with the current technologies, which is art as the exploration of the state space of consciousness. So like with Midjourney or ChatGPT and so on, they're not. I mean, like you could sample from the string of all possible texts by just like writing a simple program that like strings together words, right? Selected from the dictionary at random. But most of that is going to be gibberish, right? Whereas if you sample from GPT-3 at random a sentence that it thinks a human might write, you're actually exploring the state space of possible sentences in a much more kind of efficient way. By prompting it, you're exploring the state space of sentences. And the same with a Midjourney, you're exploring like meaningful images. And therefore, it's like a more efficient way of exploring the space of possible experiences. But there's more to it because, selecting a random image, even if it's like a valid image, is not necessarily very artistic. There's something else interesting that art is doing, which is like model 6 is messing with the energy parameter. I mean, here's where like genuine novelty and intense experiences are so relevant because they're like modifying the energy parameter. Like it's about like the intensity of consciousness as well. And then the next model is essentially valence. They're like modulating energy allows you to actually anneal, have like annealing experiences, intense states of resonance and bliss. That's something that currently, this AI art cannot do. I think it will be able to do it in the future, and you will get like, art, an annealotron, as we used to call it at QRI, but essentially, yeah, like systems that produce ecstatic experiences on demand, and they're like really incredible and like feeling transcendent. But then like the last model is what I call harmonic society, and for that is when you really require a model of consciousness, because what harmonic society is all about is having an understanding of how different aesthetics can interact with each other in a harmonious way. So like you can anticipate like, okay, this person is not going to get along well with this person. Doesn't mean that they're bad people or something. It just means that their aesthetics don't have like an adequate interface where they can create music together, as it were. So in the end, I think like the meta project of art is ultimately what I call the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic, which is when you have an aesthetic that can bring together many aesthetics and allow them to create music with each other in a harmonious way. And I think like that I think is like the future of art. And consciousness, models of consciousness are like a core aspect of it.
That feels really good to hear. It feels nice.
Awesome.
Um, all right, so we've explored a lot here today, from whether AI models might be conscious, whether digital computers can be conscious, and a lot more. Coming to the end here, I'm just want to give you an open space in case you'd like to share any final thoughts on the state of AI models and whether or not they'll be conscious, and the future of consciousness studies, and how everything might go in the end.
I mean, I think the more people start thinking seriously about the binding problem, the better the future will probably go, because the more chances there's going to be to actually, yeah, tackle these issues properly. And I mean, I would simply like I would simply encourage the audience to think of the binding problem not as a, you thought it once and you're done with it sort of thing. It's more kind of like a lifelong, like, hey, actually this is very mysterious and it continues to be mysterious, and have a relationship with it, as opposed to just think of it as like, oh, like check mark, yes, I've thought about that. Because I think it's very similar to like something like enlightenment, or like codependent arising, or emptiness, or something like that. It's something you can develop a relationship with, will give you more perspectives, and you shouldn't think that you quote unquote already understand it, because that's just going to close a lot of avenues.
I love the introduction of the Hedonium Shockwave to the end here. So yeah, thank you so much, Andres. Where are the best places to find and follow you?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter with my name, and all of my crazy posts. You can find me on YouTube also by Googling my name. I mean, YouTubing my name. And at qri.org.
Okay. Links for these will be in the description of this episode. Andres, thank you so much. It's always a huge pleasure. This was so much fun. I love Hedonium Shockwave and everything we've explored here. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. Infinite bliss, everybody. Ciao.
A very special thanks to Anarchus and Dolly for becoming patrons of Mu. It's support like this that makes this podcast possible. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support more content on Qualia, the computational properties of consciousness, the symmetry theory of valence, and more, you can do so by joining us on Patreon at the link below. There you'll get access to benefits not publicly available. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to us on YouTube or your preferred podcasting platform by searching for Mu.